Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the channel. I am using a different lens today, if you haven't noticed. I feel like more recently in these videos, my face has been very close up to the camera. So I decided to go ahead and switch it and utilize a different lens and put myself a little bit further back so I'm not all up in your face, you know, like this, you know, and like... We got some personal space between us. Anyways, welcome back to the channel. I'm glad to see you all here again. We are going to go ahead and tackle a new project today. Because what else do we do on here? We're going to go ahead and take a look at how I made the helmet from the first Gladiator movie, Tigris of Gaul. You know what time it is. It is sanding time, and we are hitting this thing with our mouse sander with 60 grit sandpaper. The biggest thing that I'm trying to do now is get any residual glue that I used for these seam lines off, and I'm also starting to, of course, break down some of those layer lines just to begin with, so that way we start out a little less rough than what it, of course, comes out as for the print. But honestly, I mean, this print looks great just in general because of the Bamboo Lab P1S. I'm not sponsored by them, but man, I wish I was. And then, of course, we're going to go ahead and take all this dust off, and we're going to get into the actual filling of those really big cracks with the Bondo putty, the two-part putty. And then, of course, I'm going to put over the red spotting and glazing putty as well. As always with these projects, we want to go ahead and a bulk of the work is obviously going to go ahead and be done with sanding. So with this one more specifically, because it was a bigger project and there were multiple bigger different pieces, it took a lot of sanding and a lot of time with sanding because I needed everything to be uniform so that the paint itself looked uniform all over. I couldn't just obviously give more attention to one specific place other than the other. But obviously the biggest things that I wanted to make sure that I got right and I got obviously taken care of was the fill lines, because there were some decent gaps between the pieces, and also I wanted to, of course, make sure that the fill lines looked good so that way it looked like one seamless and flawless piece that printed. Now you'll see I'm hitting this again with the mouse sander, of course, with the 80 grit sandpaper this time, after I've gone over both with the two-part Bondo and the red Bondo. And I'm going to go ahead and sand those down as much as possible before I go in with some just regular sandpaper. Now we come to the best part for filling in those layer lines, those tiny layer lines, and that's going to be the resin and talcum powder method. Now, this honestly saved me so much time. It allowed me to go ahead and fill in those deep grooves, those tiny grooves and those tiny cracks and crevices. It gave me such a great finish. I didn't have to go ahead and use a ton of Bondo. I just mixed the resin and I mixed the talcum powder. It's not really equal parts. I would say you want to just make it like kind of a little bit of a thicker paste, but not too much. Or I wouldn't really say a paste at all. I would say you just want to make it, you know, just to the point where it's a little bit thicker than the resin. And then, of course, you're going to smear it on. You know, wipe it on, whatever you want to do. Get it all in each of the areas that you need to, so that way once you cure it and once you sand it, it's really going to fill in those lines. Then, of course, I'm using a different brush here. I'm using kind of I don't know what it's called, one of those sponge brushes, but here's the thing, right? It broke down over time as I was using it. It was great to go ahead and hold and store some of the resin in there, and then I could just go ahead and, like, you know, kind of brush it on and dab it on, and it came out well. But the problem was that it was just not holding up. I think the resin broke it down and it just wasn't working well. So maybe this is good for smaller projects, but for a bigger project like this, where I was using it a lot, you know, I don't think it was working well. So I would say just stick with either a silicone brush or just a regular brush, and you can actually clean that brush off, that regular brush, with the isopropyl alcohol. It'll break down the resin, any residual resin in between the bristles, and you won't have to throw it away. Now, a big thing that helped with smoothing out this print and filling in those layer lines, which I talked about in a previous video, was the talcum powder and resin method. And I mean, that was just, it filled in lines so beautifully and so perfectly. It really made me have to sand a little bit harder, but it was so worth it in the long run, and it was so worth it in the end because it saves me so much time. I didn't have to continuously use Bondo. I didn't have to use really any other methods other than just, you know, wiping it on, not wiping it, but you know what I mean, with a brush, sanding it, and then of course, you know, doing it over and over again is how many layers that I needed to. For this project specifically, for all the pieces, I did 2 coats of the resin and talcum powder. So I went ahead, and the first time was after I had done 80 grit sandpaper. So I did the 60 and 80 grit sandpaper, right? Finished that. Then I did the first layer of the resin and talcum powder, cured it, wiped it off with isopropyl alcohol, 91% isopropyl alcohol. And then once it dried and finished drying and everything like that, I sanded it again, this time with 120. And then I did another round of the resin and talcum powder. And then after that round, I did the exact same process, spraying it with the alcohol, getting all the residue off, you know, of any uncured resin. Then I did 150, 180, obviously filling in between with filler primer, and then, you know, finally hitting it with the 220 wet sanding, the 400 wet sanding, the 600 wet sanding, and the 1500 wet sanding. Now I am getting into the final rounds of sanding. This is with 150 sandpaper. I'm going to go over this entire thing, and then of course I'm going to do the 180 grit sandpaper before we go ahead and get into our wet sanding. Now with the wet sanding, and I will always admit when I'm wrong. I was wrong with the wet sanding. Normally with most of my projects, I only go up to 400 grit sandpaper and I do a wet sand with 400 grit sandpaper. With this project, this was my first experiment with it. I did 600 grit sandpaper wet and 1500 grit sandpaper wet. And it made all the difference. So moving forward, I stand corrected. I am going to take the time to do more of a wet sand with finer grits of sandpaper because it definitely made the difference. And I definitely think that the paint looks the way that it does because it was so silky smooth, the actual helmet itself. Now, wet sanding, this is the process that I do. I literally just go into my house, go into the sink, throw it in my sink, and let the water run over it as I sand over top of it. If you have a sink that's a little bit deeper, this is why, you know, I'm doing it in here. But if you don't, you know, maybe use some sort of bin that you can fill up with water, maybe dip it in there. Or if you have an outside source of water, you know, you can do it outside as well. But really anywhere, obviously, that's not gonna be cumbersome or in the way of anything. But, you know, I was able to use my inside sink. It was easy for me. I just, you know, was able to stand up and sand. So this is the process of obviously the wet sanding. So for the paint process, in terms of what I actually used and what I actually did for it, was I used a gloss black. I used just a generic gloss black. The reason why I used such a generic gloss black spray paint was because I was going to use a super high gloss clear coat over top of that before I put the silver paint on. So what it looked like was black gloss, then super high gloss clear coat, then silver on top of that. This is the Tigris of Gaul helmet. And of course you're gonna see, you just saw the video, but you know, just, I mean, it, looking at it like in the first person and in first hand, I'm really impressed with how I did and how it looks in terms of a finished product. I mean, of course, you know, I put in a lot of effort and I put in a lot of work, but there's hardly any layer lines. There's no seam lines whatsoever. I really took the time because this was, you know, this was something that I really wanted to turn out well, and I'm so glad as to how it looks because it looks phenomenal. Yes, you can wear it. It is full size compared to my head, and it does fit my big head. But yes, you can wear it. It is a bit snug, but that's okay. That doesn't bother me whatsoever. And I mean, it's just a beautiful display piece, and it is something that I am, you know, definitely proud of. And this might be one of my favorite projects that I've worked on, and one of my best looking projects that I've worked on as well. Thank you all so very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, I would greatly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. If you do have any comments or questions or would like me to go more in depth on something, please let me know. I am always open to having discussions or making a video even potentially about something that you might want more information on, or something that you might want me to dive more deeper into. If you do have any suggestions on videos that you'd like to see or projects that you'd like me to work on, please let me know. Like I said, you can either leave it in the comments down below, or you can hit me up on my Instagram at gstudios_art. I will see you all in the next video. Take care.